Recently, we uploaded a video called Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree's Peak Artificial Difficulty. In that video, we explained some of the things that are happening in Elden Ring's DLC that make it unfair and overly punishing just for the sake of being difficult. One of the things that we didn't do in that video was define artificial difficulty. So now we're making a separate one to cover that as a topic all on its own. What is artificial difficulty in video games? Now, the problem is artificial difficulty, while useful and while I think people will generally understand what you mean when you say that, it isn't the most precise term. Because when you think artificial difficulty in the sense of video games, it doesn't make a ton of sense. In some sense, all difficulty in video games is artificial, since the difficulty wouldn't exist had you not taken it upon yourself to play the game. So perhaps a better term, and the term that we're going to be using in this discussion, is fair and unfair difficulty. So then that begs the question, well, what is fairness in the context of a video game? And it's going to depend largely on genre, mechanics, lore, things of that nature. There are a lot of variables that can change what fairness means from game to game. Therefore, a lot of this conversation is going to be contextual. By way of example, taking on 100 enemies at the same time is not an issue in an action game like Diablo 4. But taking on 100 enemies at a time in a Souls game is a disaster. So now let's define what we mean. When we say fair difficulty, what we mean is the proper application of knowledge, skill, and mechanics that are communicated by the game to aid the player in overcoming the game's difficulty.
And when we say communication, we don't mean that we want it to be so overt that your companion tells you exactly how to solve a puzzle as soon as you come up on it. Things can be communicated to the player through visuals in the environment that make it feel a whole lot more organic.
What we don't want is Atreus screaming every 5 seconds, "Hey father, move this block."
What about freezing the geyser under the wheel? Maybe. Hey, looks like you stopped the water flow in that trough. There's a brazier to the left of the chest. Maybe you can light it?
What we mean when we talk about unfair difficulty is that the player has trouble succeeding because of external factors not relating to your knowledge, skill, or understanding of mechanics. Unfair difficulty is when difficulty has no relationship to your ability as a player. You may think of examples like Destiny 2, when boss damage is cranked up to an insane degree, but so is their health bar. So the battle becomes a battle of attrition that many people find unfun and unfair.
And when it's purely a boost in numbers, such as boss HP, it lessens the enjoyment for a lot of people because it makes your weapons feel like squirt guns.
Now, let's also say at the outset, the thing that makes this conversation hard is there's a lot of subjectivity involved. Unfair difficulty is not always unfun, nor is fair difficulty always fun. But I think in order to maximize a person's enjoyment of a game, there needs to be some balance. And there needs to be some general rules and things to look for as we interact with these games that give them some level of fairness and a challenge to keep us engaged. So let's talk about examples of fair difficulty. Examples of fair difficulty would be when rules are clearly established and then consistently applied. One of the things we may think about is the red attacks from Lies of P. Now, this is clearly communicated through a tutorial in-game. You see a red attack and the tutorial tells you perfect pairing is the way to deal with this move. Now, this tutorial, while clear, does leave out some nuance and allows for the player to find various things on their own. For example, in that tutorial, it says that you can't dodge red attacks. Well, the issue is you can dodge red attacks. But what's meant by that, and I suspect a lot of this is lost in translation, is that when you try and dodge, red attacks ignore your iframes. So they will hit you even if you dodge through them trying to use iframes. But you can get out of the way of them with a dodge and be just fine. Now let's also add the caveat that attacks that require this mechanic may not be fair attacks, but the mechanic itself works as intended and is clearly communicated to the player with a nice degree of nuance. Another example of fair difficulty is when bosses are granted additional mechanical complexity or smarter AI rather than just statistical boost. A good example of this is bosses in Hades as you turn the heat up. As you turn the heat up, the bosses get new moves that require a greater understanding of their mechanics in order to conquer them. It's not just a statistical boost. Now, in terms of smarter AI, one of the best examples I think I've seen is Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, or Shadow of War, both of them work, where orc captains will adapt to your behavior, meaning you can't spam the same thing over and over again. They will figure you out. But to further illustrate the point, fair difficulty encourages players to understand and use available mechanics, and to optimize the way they use mechanics. Another good example is in The Witcher 3, say on normal difficulty. If you don't want to use potions, you don't have to. If you don't want to optimize your gear, you don't have to. If you don't want to optimize your spell usage, you don't have to. But as you work your way up the difficulty, and as you work your way up to Death March, the game almost requires the optimal use of these things. So it's difficulty that as it increases, your understanding of the mechanics also have to increase to ensure success. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of skilled players that could do it even without these things, but if you value your sanity, you will use them.
And in the Witcher example, it's nice that there's actually an in-game lore reason to use these mechanics as well. Crafting and drinking the right potions and using the proper oil on your sword for a specific beast helps make the higher difficulty more manageable, but it also was perfectly in line with how Witchers in this universe prepare for monster hunts. Another good example of a game that requires specific mechanics to overcome a certain challenge is Doom Eternal. The Marauder in Doom Eternal was an enemy that, at least at the time of the game's release, was pretty contentious. When you fight the Marauder for the first time, you actually get a pop-up tutorial that gives you some good information. It'll tell you that at close range that he'll shotgun you, at long range he's going to throw projectiles at you, and that you need to keep him at mid-range and counter him whenever his eyes flash green. It also sets the expectation right away that he's resistant to super weapons so that you don't waste a ton of ammo against him. I don't personally find the Marauder all that fun to fight, but he is difficult and he's very fairly designed. He's fast, he's aggressive, and his punish window is fairly small, but it is consistent. When he uses his gap close move on you, his eyes will flash green just before he hits you, allowing you to shoot him and interrupt his attack.
And although the game tells you generically what you have to do to beat him, there's still room for nuance and discovery in the actual fight itself.
To that point, the game tells you to keep him at mid-range, but it doesn't explain specifically what mid-range looks like in Doom Eternal. And if you look back at videos of people struggling against him at the time of release, most of them weren't fighting him in the proper range that you need to bait his gap close and be able to punish him. Furthermore, the game doesn't at all tell you the way his dog summon works, so even with the informative tutorial you get the first time you fight him, you can only figure out that the dog gets summoned when he blocks shots with his shield through trial and error. Also, it's worth noting that for the more hardcore players, tutorials can be turned off altogether to give you a true blind experience if that's what you want.
So the ultimate point we're trying to make as it comes to defining fair difficulty and the examples we've given is to show that developers need to teach the player rather than just to punish them without the player knowing why they're being punished. Devs need to clearly communicate the rules to limit player frustration. And in this way, devs sort of act like a father figure or a teacher to the player. And when games are unfair, when they lie to you, when they don't teach you the things that you need to know, that can be immensely frustrating and immensely unfair. But when they do teach you, and they give you these rules and patterns that you can rely upon and expect, then that allows you to create these strategies and effectively use all the tools they give you to overcome the challenge that you've been presented with.
So, the basic formulas of level design go. When you start out, you want to teach the player how to play. And you need to make sure that they understand every mechanic of the game. So every level in the first chapter needs to have some example forcing the player to do something in order to beat the level that they will need further in the game.
Now, as it pertains to these rules, the game needs to abide by the rules that it sets for the universe and those within it, or at the very least, maintain some level of fairness when it attempts to break these rules. Because there is room for subversion in all of this. And there are many times you can have a powerful example of subversion that really amplifies the player's enjoyment of a game. So the ultimate point is, know the rules so that when you break them, you can break them effectively and in service to engaging the player rather than frustrating the player. One excellent use of subversion, in my opinion, is the Guardian Ape in Sekiro. Because the moment you kill him and behead him, you're thinking, okay, the boss is done. And you even get a prompt on screen that says the enemy's been defeated. But then the game subverts you, and it has a lore reason for doing so by the ape reviving. And you should see some of the reaction videos online that show how engaged this makes people. Now, I don't think people would be terribly excited about this if what happened when the ape revived, if he immediately grabs you. Instead, what the ape does is very fair. Because although he subverts your expectation, you can clearly see the fight's not over, and the ape then begins to stand up without attacking you, giving you time to respond.
Well, it's essentially just a second phase in the boss fight, but it's done in such a way that it adds some surprise and excitement.
It's a breaking of the rules that adds rather than subtracts from an experience. To show that there are times whenever it is effective and useful for a game to bend and play with the rules. But it has to be done very judiciously. Let's move on now to examples of unfair difficulty, or what some may call artificial difficulty. Unfair difficulty is when games fail to provide the clear feedback that the players need to help them understand where they went wrong. Now, as we talked about earlier, this doesn't have to be overt, and it's often better taught through visuals. Generally in the Souls series, or Bloodborne, or Sekiro, or games like that, if you see a vertical attack, you want to move horizontally to avoid it, because that's the information you're being presented when someone lifts their weapon over their head. As they're about to bring it down vertically, you move horizontally. Now, a problem is introduced whenever you'll have bosses that have awful, misleading telegraphs that essentially lie to the player.
Jesus Christ, the delay is insane. How long you have to wait? Huh?
Perhaps the best example are delayed attacks. Now, I don't like delayed attacks. I don't think they're fun. I don't think they're good. But many people do, and there are plenty of people that have fun with delayed attacks. So in order to keep things on a more objective track, let's talk about some of the telegraphs for these delayed attacks. Because there can be times whenever a delayed attack has a bad telegraph or a good telegraph. Perhaps the worst example of all is Horalu's grab attack, where he freezes mid-air just to grab you and throw off your roll timing. Now, what blows my mind is this isn't true for all delayed attacks. That in the same game, Elden Ring, you'll have bosses like Horalu with terrible telegraphs, and then you'll have bosses like Mohg or Midra with excellent telegraphs. And both can use delayed attacks. So the issue isn't necessarily delayed attacks, but it's how these delayed attacks are telegraphed that's the issue. Mohg's delayed attacks make perfect sense. He's wielding a massive spear with one hand, and so he swings it rather slowly in a delayed method. Or you may even think of Midra. And Midra is probably the best boss in Shadow of the Erdtree. And one of the reasons why is Midra has very clear telegraphs that communicate exactly what he's going to do. And so although most of his attacks are delayed, the animation legibility is incredible. The telegraphs are incredible, leading to a good and fair boss fight. I think this goes to show that delayed attacks aren't inherently fair or unfair, but the issue tends to come with a proper telegraphing of these attacks. So delayed attacks are fine so long as there's a visual justification for why the attack is delayed. And when that visual justification isn't there, that can lead to a feeling of unfairness or the game cheating just to beat you. And there are games that cheat to beat you.
I want to give a couple of examples of unfair difficulty across several different genres of games to fully illustrate what we mean when we talk about games breaking their own rules. In Forza Horizon 5, cranking the difficulty up creates weird scenarios that aren't possible by the game's own rules. When you set the AI difficulty up to max, you can be outrun on a straightaway by a farm truck that has a base speed of 3 while driving a Vulcan AMR with a base speed of 7.7. Now, I am aware there are tunes in the game that can alter stats, but with this big of a disparity, it's not possible. Another example in the sports genre would be Madden. When you play the game on all Madden difficulty, you'll see a weird phenomenon where the AI defensive backs are psychic and know the routes your receivers are going to run. They will preemptively move towards the spot the receiver is going to, so that rather than the defender having to actually react to the multiple directions the receiver could go when they come out of their break, they already know where he's headed because the AI knows what play you called. Madden also uses a concept called dynamic difficulty adjustment that seeks to artificially keep games closer to keep players more engaged. Now, this is a big issue when it comes to online play because the player in the lead often gets punished and the losing player often benefits from it. It typically plays out in small ways where the losing player will get more favorable animations like falling forward for extra yards, or 50-50 balls that hang up in the air off of, say, a deflection will tend to more often be caught or intercepted by the losing team, whereas for the winning team, they simply just fall to the ground. It will even occasionally cause a scenario where the losing team calls a defense and their defensive players will actually abandon their assignments. For example, a player will blitz even though they were supposed to drop into a deep zone, leaving that area of the field wide open for the opponent. We can also look at fighting games, with Mortal Kombat 2 being a good example. The AI in this game is able to read button inputs, which allows them to fully counter your moves. For example, you can throw an uppercut, and just milliseconds before it connects with the AI opponent's chin, they're able to grab you out of it, which a human player would never be able to do. Or you can go for a low sweep on them, and they will time a low sweep of their own just in a perfect, unreactable window that allows theirs to evade yours and punish you.
Other examples of unfair difficulty in games cheating to beat you could be ambushes in Fire Emblem games. There are so many times when an ambush will come with zero warning, and it happens on enemy phase, so then the enemies that ambush you that you didn't know were coming can now wipe your characters out and potentially permakill them. Or you may think also of Dark Souls 3. In some examples, there will be attacks that hit you even when you have iframes, and will hit you through your iframes with no warning that this is going to happen. Furthermore, in Elden Ring, you'll have enemies that legitimately read your animations. Now, this is very, very similar to input reading, but instead of reacting to the button press, they react to the animation of your character. And let's not forget about Melania breaking all the pre-established rules and having animation canceling, which makes her even more cancer to deal with.
Another example is Halo 2 when playing on Legendary mode. You can come around a corner in that game and be sniped by a Jackal sniper the instant you enter their field of view, killing you in one shot. And on top of that, the checkpointing system in that game is broken, so if you happen to get an unlucky checkpoint right before you get head tapped by a Jackal, your game basically turns into a montage of Master Chief just getting mollywopped over and over.
And all of these hopefully serve as good examples of unfair difficulty that games should generally try to avoid. Because in almost all of these examples, the only thing they will result in is player frustration rather than an enhanced experience. Now, finally, as we talk about examples of unfair difficulty, it's important to mention things like technical issues, poor controls, poor hitboxes, bad design. Things like this are always unfair difficulty. Let's get more specific. Let's talk about the camera in FromSoft games. I think all of us can agree the camera in FromSoft games is trash, and it's needed to change for a long time. And this can be fixed simply by backing it up. Go on YouTube and watch some of the videos of a guy fighting a boss with a camera backed up and notice how much better that makes the experience with such a small change. We could also talk about performance issues adding to a game's difficulty. I'm specifically thinking of Cyberpunk 2077, which was downright unplayable on launch and is still a mess now. It's better, but it's still a mess, and there are plenty of performance issues that can lead to the player dying and having no clue why he died.
Yeah, player skill doesn't really come into play when you hop into a vehicle and your character just randomly decides to T-pose, leaving you open to fire, or the vehicle just spontaneously combusts and kills you.
Yeah, not exactly the fairest thing that ever happened. Or we could also talk about the unfair hitboxes that have plagued many of these games. Now, unfair hitboxes have plagued every one of the Souls games, and you can find examples of good hitboxes, but you can also find massive examples of terrible hitboxes. And hitboxes are clearly, unequivocally, unfair difficulty, because the hitbox doesn't match the model that the player sees, and so the information the player's receiving is false. And then as it pertains to bad design, we could use an example, say an example of bad level design. Do you boys remember the Capra Demon boss fight? Where you are thrown into a tiny room with the Capra Demon, and oh, not just the Capra Demon, the two dogs, in a tiny room that make this fight a disaster, and so much harder than it needs to be. And all of this is just downright unfair, and could easily be avoided by just a little bit better design. To wrap this video up, I want to remind you all of a point that we made earlier, which is that, strangely enough, fair doesn't always mean fun. And unfair doesn't always mean unfun. These things are largely subjective. And even so, there are times when a judicious injection of unfair difficulty can add to the player's experience rather than harm it. There may be times in a Dark Souls game where you're ambushed. And depending on the player, this may lead to excitement or frustration. It really depends on you. Or there may even be games, say like roguelikes, that are so dependent on RNG that a run can feel doomed from the start, and that can be frustrating. Or people can find it fun and challenging to find ways to overcome a difficult and seemingly doomed run. But as a general rule, games should understand the delicate balance of difficulty within games and aim for fairness to limit frustration and minimize the urge to quit playing. Or if you really want, maybe you could even have difficulties that will advertise that they're clearly unfair for people who want the ultimate challenge, even if they acknowledge that it's unfair. And I suppose the key to all of this is making sure we have a little bit of moderation. and moderation is absolutely key when it comes to injecting unfair difficulty into a game. Perhaps a good way around all of this is to use a system like the one that Left 4 Dead 1 and 2 use, with the AI director, where based on how well or how poorly a player is doing, the AI director will adjust the things that they throw at you. Say, for example, if you're doing very well, that may increase the enemy spawn. Or if you're getting destroyed, that may increase the item distribution and you may find more health packs. While this may be unfair if you know about it, it doesn't feel unfair as you're playing through it, because the game is actively working to keep you engaged by increasing the challenge or decreasing the challenge as you need it. And I think the brilliance of this system is keeping it invisible, so players don't feel like the game is being unfair, rather they simply feel engaged.
The reason that the Left 4 Dead AI director works, even though it's essentially using the same concept of dynamic difficulty adjustment I mentioned being a problem in Madden, is because that in Madden, it's being used in online play and punishing you for outplaying your opponent. Whereas in Left 4 Dead, it's more of a balance mechanic to keep the game from being so hard that it's frustrating, but also keep it from being so easy that it's boring. It adapts to the specific group of players in the game and does so organically to keep them engaged.
Which, as we said before, it's all going to come down to context. Context matters in the course of this discussion, and context should be taken into careful consideration when using difficulty and injecting it into your games. That being said, I think there's something we can all agree on, which is that games don't need to be difficult. What they need to be is good. And if at all possible, one of the things that I think devs should aim for is to make a game with fair difficulty to minimize frustration. And if I catch you saying skill issue in the comments, prepare to get cooked.